Hello, subscribers! Due to some difficulties with OBS constantly trying to route my microphone through the webcam, I've unhooked my webcam. But that's fine because you weren't going to see much of me anyway in this video. Today I'm going to be responding to one of Inspiring Philosophy's worst videos he ever made, titled Top 10 Biblical Problems for Young Earth Creationism. And the thumbnail said that the Bible does not teach young Earth creationism, or something like that. The Bible does not teach a young Earth. I think that's what it said. When I originally watched this video, I tried to comment on it. I made a list separate on a notepad, which I then tried to cut and paste into the comment section, but YouTube would not allow it. It said, YouTube's been stingy with my comment. I had a rebuttal to each of these failed arguments, but YouTube won't post them. So, instead, I decided to make a video about it. And since I still have my original comments saved, I will go ahead and give those as well. So, let's go ahead and watch and see how Inspiring Philosophy tries to justify his false beliefs.
There are millions of people today who believe the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. And about 4,000 years ago, there was a worldwide flood that destroyed all life on land, except for a few people and 2 of every animal that survived in an ark. The basis of this theory comes from many who say we ought to take a literal or plain reading of the Bible, the holy book of Christianity. The rationale behind this young Earth view.
I find it weird that he made it sound like he doesn't believe the Bible is the holy word of Christianity, as he puts it. Would have said the holy word of God, but whatever. I just find that very odd that he calls himself a Christian, and that made it sound like he doesn't believe the Bible is the word of God.
But what many young Earth creationists don't realize is that there are several passages within the Bible itself that create problems for the young Earth theory. Meaning if we took the plain reading of the text in many places, it would actually contradict the view that the Earth and the universe are only about 6,000 years old.
Now, remember that, as the entire point of this video that he just set out is that the plain reading of the Bible would discredit young Earth doctrine. I tell you to pay attention to that because he is not going to stick to it. He sets out this video as if to say, here are 10 Bible verses which the plain reading of would contradict young Earth, but he veers off that topic very quickly.
These are the top 10 biblical passages that create problems for the young Earth theory. Number 10.
Most top 10 lists would start with the worst argument, but he's actually going to start with his best argument. And number 1 will actually be his worst argument. It's completely backwards. But you'll see why he starts with his best argument very quickly, because very quickly he will veer off the topic he set for himself.
Genesis 17:17. And then in Genesis 17 it reads, Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?
Oh, there's something else I noticed. He's actually begging the question with his, with his emphasis. He emphasizes the age, but he doesn't know that's what Abraham was emphasizing. Abraham could have been emphasizing the child, and that of course would be much more reasonable to assume he's emphasizing the child, not the age.
So Abraham thinks it's biologically impossible for someone past the age of 100.
You don't know that. You're presuming that to fit your own theory. There's nothing to say he thought it was biologically impossible. After all, his father, well, you're gonna go over that.
To have a child. But this seems to contradict the ages of his ancestors, also known as the early patriarchs, who were supposed to live for hundreds of years and have children in their old ages. According to the Masoretic dates, many of Abraham's ancestors were supposed to be alive when God made this promise to Abraham in his 100th year, and his ancestor Eber supposedly outlived him.
And did Abraham know any of them? We don't know that. For all we know, he never met Eber. The text does not say. I very rarely saw my grandpa, let alone ever actually talked to him, let alone my great-grandparents, although they were dead, so that's not exactly comparable there. But still, there's not a whole lot of reason to assume Abraham knew his great-great-great-grandfather. It's possible. It may even be somewhat likely given cultural context, but we don't actually know that for sure.
So shouldn't Abraham's reply to God have been that many people alive are having children in their old ages? So having a child at the age of 100 is perfectly normal.
No, because
More importantly is the fact that based on what Genesis 12 says, Abraham's own father Terah would have had to have fathered Abraham at his own age of 130. So shouldn't Abraham's reply to God have been that having a child past the age of 100 is perfectly normal? After all, his own father had him when he was 130.
No, because nobody talks like that. That is asinine.
The whole episode in Genesis 17 implies Abraham didn't know of anyone, his own father included, who had a child past the age of 100. And this would have...
No, it doesn't, because it gives us the ages. The implication that he is 100 and Sarah is 90 is already there. The implication that this verse gives us is that he was joyful at the prospect of having his own child, someone with Sarah, someone who God will later call his only child, even though obviously he had other children.
would imply that when Genesis assigns high ages to the patriarchs, it is probably not their literal ages, but symbolic numbers for theological messaging.
And what is the symbolic message of each of these numbers? Because I look at these numbers and it seems pretty arbitrary to say that they're symbolic of something.
And that would mean Genesis doesn't give us a literal chronology back to the creation of Adam, damaging the young earth creationist view that the Bible documents through the ages of the patriarchs that the earth is only 6,000 years old. For a better understanding,
If you can prove that the ages are not literal and instead symbolic, that would be the most damaging thing to young earth creationism. Although you'd still have to contend with the science, but this video doesn't deal with science. Not that inspiring philosophy ever deals with the science, but the plain, you do not get the symbolism he's going for from a plain reading of the text. And he certainly doesn't argue for that in here.
of the symbolic view of the ages of the patriarchs, see our video on Genesis 5. Number 9.
And I don't believe his Genesis 5 video actually does a good job at proving the ages are symbolic, but again, even if they did, that's not something you got from the plain reading of the text. Now, let's go to the comment I had attempted to post about this one. Abraham surprised at his old age. This isn't a problem for the ages of people given. It's a problem for understanding what Abraham believed and or meant. Men do not have a time limit on having children. Men do not go through menopause. Women do. His focus could have been on Sarah, and he included himself because they were one flesh. We know how old his father was. We do not know how old his mother was. He could have just been waxing poetic at the idea of having a legitimate son and didn't mean to imply any impossibility. And of course, if you take all the ages as symbolic, which itself makes no sense, then you would have to take this age as symbolic as well, which leaves you with the same problem. And that's the end of that comment, but there's some other stuff I forgot to mention, that Abraham's age of 100 and Sarah's age of 90 is reaffirmed later in that same chapter, and that verse he was quoting was obviously synonymous parallelism. So if there was something metaphorical going on in that verse, it wasn't the ages, because those are reaffirmed later in the chapter.
Genesis 8. When Genesis records that God flooded the earth, it should be understood as literally the entire globe, because it says the waters covered the face of the whole earth. But there is a problem for this view within Genesis 8. Verses 4 and 5 say the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat or Aratu, and the tops of the mountains could be seen at this point. However, later in the chapter, Noah releases a dove and it returns to him because the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. But didn't verse 5 say the tops of the mountains were seen? So verse 9 cannot mean the waters were literally covering the whole earth, implying the entire flood account might be hyperbolic in its description of the flood, and this would mean it was not literally covering the entire globe, but just a regional area.
Stop that. You do not get regional flood out of hyperbole. I'm gonna go ahead and read my comment I tried posting about this. Well, this was a weak argument. Yeah, there is room for some hyperbole, but you still can't get away from the flood being global by appealing to hyperbole. He tries to argue hyperbole, but forgets about the dove he just mentioned. If the flood was regional, the dove should have had no trouble finding a place to rest. The dove didn't even rest on the mountaintops that were now visible.
So it appears the flood account is describing the flood hyperbolically. It doesn't necessarily teach the entire globe was covered. Number 8.
It does necessarily teach that, and it doesn't matter that it's being slightly hyperbolic. Genesis 7:19, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Hyperbole does not get you out of this. No one would be that hyperbolic to say all the mountains were completely covered. Maybe you could argue that the water wasn't 15 cubits above the mountains, but we still know the mountains were covered. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in saying that the mountains became uncovered. That would be a bit silly.
Genesis 2:24. In my debate with Kent Hovind, I asked if he takes all of Genesis 1 and 2 literally, and he replied,
I have a question for Ken on Genesis 2. Do you take the entire chapter of Genesis 2 literally?
Absolutely.
But this is actually impossible, because Genesis 2:24 cannot be understood literally. After Adam...
Yeah, because Kent Hovind is so careful with his words. So we are three points in, and he's already gone off the topic that he originally set out for his video of using the plain reading of the text to disprove young earth creationism. Now, instead of going after young earth creationism, he's going after young earth creationists, specifically Kent Hovind, because he likes stealing candy from babies. Kent Hovind isn't exactly the most careful of debaters, and I'll just go ahead and read the comment I had planned for this one right now. This is just a non sequitur or a red herring. The point of this video was supposed to be that the plain reading of the Bible doesn't support young earth, but in this one he just goes off on a tangent about some people using the word literally loosely. This has absolutely nothing to do with the premise of the video. Comment over. And this is also very uncharitable to Kent Hovind and other young earth creationists who use the word literally. It is obvious that Kent Hovind does not mean literally in this hyper-literal fashion that IP is going to argue for.
Adam is introduced to Eve. It reads, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Since married couples are not sewn together, this obviously cannot be understood as literal. Some young earth believers...
Nor does Kent Hovind literally believe it's literal. Understand what he means when he says he takes it literally. Means he takes it seriously. That it means what it says.
Try to get around this by saying it's a reference to procreation in the act of making children. But that would mean they interpret the phrase becoming one flesh metaphorically to mean having offspring, since the text does not literally say to make children.
And you can bring that up to Kent Hovind if you want, but it has nothing to do with young Earth creationism, or what the Bible says, really.
Verse 24 is obviously metaphorical language, but that means the text of Genesis 1 and 2 could also be using other metaphors and was not meant to be entirely literal.
And if it is, they're pretty easy to spot. Context clues will help a lot here.
Number 7. Genesis 3:22. Genesis 3 recounts the fall of Adam and Eve in the exile from the Garden of Eden. Young Earth creationists believe before this there was no death, so Adam and Eve would had to have been created immortal, and the fall resulted in their bodies being made mortal, and consequently,
Why? Why would you think that? This is IP going against certain young Earth creationists that I assume he's talked to. But there's nothing about young Earth creationism that says people were created immortal.
death came as a result. However, Genesis 3 never says their bodies were changed or transformed to be mortal, meaning Adam was mortal before the fall, which implies that death was a possibility before sin entered. Number 6.
Yeah, and we don't say he wasn't mortal. I don't know where he gets the idea that Adam had to be immortal before the fall. Certainly doesn't get it from the plain reading of the text. But regardless, even then, what does that have to do with the age of the earth? Regardless of whether you think Adam was mortal or immortal, it still says there was no death before the fall. It doesn't say there was no possibility of death. And as for what my comment was on this one, I just said Romans 5:12, enough said. I actually don't need to read that. That comment seems almost irrelevant, because his whole point was irrelevant.
Genesis 2:4. Young Earth creationists often argue that Genesis 2 is a recap of what takes place on day 6 within Genesis 1, when God made humans.
No, recap is a really sloppy word for what Genesis 2 is. I'm going to go ahead and read my comment, my original comment. The word recap is misleading here and borderline strawman. Chapter 2 gives more detail. I see he does at least mention that. Chapter 2 gives more detail to the creation of man and woman. It is not a recap. IP just creates problems for his own view. Like, why did God recreate all the beasts to find a helper for Adam if there were other humans around? And why would Adam declare that she shall be called woman if Eve wasn't the first in existence?
The verse begins with, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." This is what scholars call a toledoth, and it is used throughout Genesis, almost like chapter markers for the ancient audience. However, when this phrase is used, it always introduces what comes after the person or the generations that follow him. It is never used to denote a recap of something that happened prior to this.
The problem here that IP is ignoring is that, unlike the other ones, which have a specific name attached to them, this is the generations of the heavens and earth, not a specific person. Also, he says that these don't describe stuff that already happened, but in Genesis chapter 5, this is the book of generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam, in the day when they were created. It's telling you stuff it already told you again, just like Genesis 2, kind of. Except what Genesis 2 had more detail, this one has less detail, and then quickly moves on to genealogy. IP tries to bank on the similarities between the first Toledoth and the other Toledoths, but he skips over the differences.
But this would mean what is commonly viewed as the creation of the first man in Genesis 2 is not actually the creation of the first man.
No, yes it is. And we go a little before that to Genesis 2:5, about halfway down that verse, "For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground, so there were no men." The plain reading of the text says there were no people before Adam.
Scholars like Michael Heiser note Genesis 1 speaks of encompassing all of humanity, not just one man or one couple, implying when God made man in his image, it was meant to include all humans, wherever they were existing at that time. Then Genesis 2,
which there were only two of them existing at that time,
picks up after this with the creation or election of two specific individuals to act as priests in the Garden of Eden.
to their children, because they were the only people.
So because of the Toledoth in Genesis 2, the implication is Adam came after, when all humanity was made in the image of God.
If by Adam you mean his name Adam, but it's also clear in Genesis 2 that Adam was the first man.
Number 5, Jeremiah 4, 23-26. And in doing so, he described what happened in northern Israel by heavily borrowing from Genesis 1. He says northern Israel is now formless and void. There is no light, no man, no birds of the air, and no vegetation. Jeremiah is simply using this language to metaphorically say the northern kingdom no longer functions properly. But if the same language is used in reverse in Genesis 1, that implies all it is saying is God took a disordered cosmos.
It does not imply that at all. I'll just go to my comment. He confuses poetry for history, or vice versa. Using the same language does not necessitate the same exact meaning. This argument just doesn't follow. And IP argues against himself because he has said before he believes the days to be literal days. Jeremiah is not making a commentary on Genesis.
Number 4, Genesis 1, 14-19. The most popular objection used against young earth creationism is the fact that nights and days exist before the sun, which is created on day 4. Days and nights cannot exist without the earth rotating and moving around the sun. Young earth believers often reply by suggesting maybe there was another light source, or they will argue that God made the light on day 1 and then gathered it together into the sun on day 4.
I'm gonna go to my comment. Wow, this was a big straw man. God created light well before creating the sun. There is no maybe about it. People need the day-night cycle to tell time. God does not. And it's gonna get worse.
But this seems unlikely, since Genesis 1 talks about the sun and the moon being created together as lights, and the composition of the moon is not the same as the sun. You cannot gather light together to make the moon. It only reflects light from the sun.
First of all, God could, if he wanted. If God wanted to, he could create the moon out of actual light. I don't believe he did. Nobody does. And I don't know where IP gets this argument from. He certainly doesn't get it from the Bible. The plain reading of the text says he created light, then he created the sun. And time is gonna move whether or not you have a day-night cycle.
Also, you just cannot separate the sun into pieces and have the same resulting chemistry necessary to provide sunlight for plants. Supposedly,
Also, sunlight is not the same as light. Sunlight is light from a specific source, like a traffic light. That was probably a bad example. But candle light, that's a better example, is light from a candle. You're not gonna call a bonfire candlelight, because that's a different kind of source, even though they're both fire.
a more likely explanation is the sun and moon are just elected to serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. Instead,
And this brings up the question of when did God decide that the sun and moon were gonna be for signs? Did he create them and then wait billions of years and suddenly decide, Oh, you know what? I know a good use for these. I'm gonna have them be for seasons and signs. No! That is ridiculous. He created them with that intent.
Number 3. Genesis 1:28. As noted before, young Earth believers say before the fall, the Earth was blissful and perfect, with no death or suffering. But Genesis 1:28 suggests the opposite was true.
No, it doesn't.
Humanity is told to subdue the earth and have dominion over all animals. In Hebrew, these words are extremely harsh. The first word is used of war conquest and enslavement. The second word refers to ruling harshly over someone or oppression. So God is telling humans to make a warlike conquest on the earth because it needs subdued, implying the earth wasn't perfect and humanity was elected to transform the earth into a better place. But to do that meant tackling the harsh environments forcefully. The scholar Joshua John Van E.
Begging the question that the environments were harsh. We know they were not harsh until after the fall.
notes the use of this second word for ruling over the animals seems to suggest humans had the right to use animals for any purpose, like food and clothing, implying they already had the right to kill and eat animals. But this means the command from God implies the earth was not a perfect, blissful creation. Instead, this verse implies the earth was chaotic and needed order brought to it. Also, humans seem to be given the right to kill animals, implying death was already in existence.
No, it doesn't. At best, it implies the possibility of death. It doesn't mean anything actually died before this.
Number 2, Bara.
Okay. My comment for the last one was IP is letting his own false beliefs that there were other people color his interpretation of the word subdue. People don't go to war with animals and plants. This is merely a command to take charge of the earth. Saying having dominion over animals means you can make them into clothes is an unwarranted extrapolation, especially when both Adam and Eve were naked and had no need for clothes. I have dominion over my cat, or I did have dominion over my cat, but I would never kill my cat. I didn't kill my cat. She died of kidney failure.
Number 2 is not so much a passage, but the use of a Hebrew word. Many young earth creationists believe this word refers to God creating out of nothing, and it is used frequently throughout Genesis 1. But looking at how the word is used outside of Genesis 1 implies bara doesn't necessarily mean creation out of nothing.
Stop. So, do you notice the double standard IP seems to have with the phrase, the plain reading of the text? Let me go down here. In his comment down here, he says, also, young myth creationists do not realize they are walking into a trap if they respond to my latest video. Let's remember, you constantly claim theistic evolutionists have to add meaning to the biblical text, and they just take the plain reading. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but his premise for this video was that he would use the plain reading. But when he talks about the young earth creationists, he thinks that when they say plain reading, it means to not look at context and just take it as it happens. But here he is attempting to give a plain reading, but going elsewhere in the Bible to get context. So he's assuming a different definition of the phrase plain reading depending on whether young earth creationist is using it or whether he is using it. And this just goes to show how uncharitable he is. When biblical creationists use the term literally, he just assumes hyper-literally.
There are times it could refer to material creation out of nothing, but it never necessarily does. And there are clear examples where bara cannot refer to material creation. So there is no reason to assume that that is the meaning in Genesis 1, especially given the previous problems that we have gone over.
What problems? Everything we've gone over so far has not been a problem. At least, not for me. Some of it, though, is definitely a problem for IP.
Implying Genesis 1 is not about material creation.
So number to borrow, my comment was, this isn't even an argument. This is just IP trying to defend his own position. Not necessitating a certain type of creation does not invalidate that type of creation. This is not a problem in the slightest. The premise of this video was to show problems, but this is not a problem.
And now finally, number 1, Genesis 1, verse 1. This may come as a shock to you, but the very first verse of the Bible can create difficulties for young Earth models.
No, it doesn't.
The reason is, over the past few decades, scholars have noted the first verse lacks a definite article in Hebrew, so the way we translate it may not be accurate. Instead, scholars like John Salhammer and Robert Homestead have argued it would make more sense to translate it as, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. What this would mean is verse 1 is no longer a complete sentence, but what we would call a dependent clause in an incomplete sentence. So this would mean verse 1 is dependent on the following clause, which is in verse 2. So Genesis is really saying, when God began to bara the heavens and the earth was formless and void. In other words,
I notice he's not putting began. He's just putting when
God started baraing the heavens and the earth, it was already there as formless and void. So many scholars note this implies Genesis 1 is not about bringing the universe and the earth into existence for the first time, but is about God transforming the earth from a chaotic state into an ordered state.
Just assuming your worldview there.
If the Hebraic form of verse 1 and 2 implies the earth was already there existing before the creation week, then the text supports an
It doesn't really imply that.
extended period of time prior to this, and is not actually stating the absolute beginning point of our universe. Now I know some of these points might come as a shock to you, but we are not arguing this creates problems for the biblical worldview, just for young Earth models that claim to be
And I'm saying it doesn't. Not a single one of those is really a problem.
based on biblical texts.
And some of those weren't, a lot of them were not even addressing young Earth creationism, they were addressing young Earth creationists and specific beliefs that may or may not be biblical.
Given all of these points, the biblical scriptures don't seem to support many of the claims of young Earth creationists.
Maybe it doesn't support some claims of some young Earth creationists, but young Earth creationism as a whole is very much supported by the text.
Luckily on this channel, we have a 15-part video
Oh, that was it. So let's go ahead and read my final comment. When in the beginning, again, like the last one, this is just IP trying to fit billions of years into the text. It does not pose a problem at all, even if all translations said when instead of in the beginning. There would be no reason to assume the Earth was already there for any significant amount of time, and the scientific evidence strongly suggests it wasn't. But here's something I didn't mention in my comment. This would be IP's worst argument because I somewhat agree with it, assuming you can get rid of the word and from the start of verse 2, so it works grammatically. When God began to create the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense grammatically. But if you get rid of and, if there's no justification for the and in verse 2, then the when beginning instead of in the beginning would make a lot more sense. But with the and, I think in the beginning probably makes more sense. Either way, this is not a problem for young Earth creationism. If we go with when God created the heaven and the earth, it just begs the question, when was that? Oh, that's right, it's in the beginning. So now, because I was late to the party on this one, I'm going to go ahead and go over one of Inspiring Philosophy's rebuttals to the challenges that were made of him, specifically from Creation Ministries. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole thing, and you can pause it if you want to read it, or just find it on, well, you can actually see the address up here, or you can find it by going to IP's YouTube channel. But let's go ahead and go over some of these specific replies, especially the ones that actually apply to what I just said. So first, he says, but the Bible does not explicitly teach a young earth. You know what else it doesn't explicitly teach? The Trinity. It does implicitly teach it though, just like it implicitly teaches that the earth is young, or 6,000 years-ish, something. And a large chunk of this response is IP just going, well, he should have looked at my Genesis video. But that, of course, will say nothing to my response. So the main objections. First we have, from Haley, Aviation Ministries, Abraham could have realized that lifespans were declining, so once he himself reached 100, he was already old, unlike his ancestors. And I would like to add that he doesn't need a specific number to know that he is old. Age is something you feel, and you can say it. It's not just you hit a number and, oh, I'm old now. But IP's response to this is, this doesn't work with biblical context, because if you do the math, the decline could not have been happening that fast. By the time of Abraham's grandson, Jacob, he was having children between 90 and 100. Jacob lived 147 years, so math. So Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. And where was Abraham during this? Because this point was number 10, was about Abraham being surprised, according to IP, that he would have a child at his age. He doesn't know his grandson is gonna have a child at 91, nor does the text give any indication that Jacob was not surprised that Joseph was born to him at 91. Except, it does say that a reason Jacob loved Joseph so much was that he was the child of his old age. So IP's argument kinda works against him. And I don't know if I made this clear earlier, but if Abraham is really surprised at his own old age being able to have children, then that age given is not symbolic. So IP's whole argument just goes out the window. On the other hand, I've got no problem with the possibility that Jacob... Wait a minute. This is Jacob at 91. How old was Rachel? We do not know. This is inspiring philosophy, forgetting about the woman. Women menstruate. Men do not. But even if age was a factor for men, there's nothing wrong with the possibility that Joseph was a bit of a miracle baby, and Jacob was just blessed to have him. Right, here's one that tries to cover something I brought up. Haley then claims it really wasn't about Abraham's age, but Sarah's old age. Always find are the people who claim to Genesis because you don't know what you don't use literal properly. Like to cherry pick when we should read Genesis literally, as in take it seriously. Anyway, Genesis 17 doesn't say the only reason was because of Sarah's age. That was a factor. Actually, that was poetry. It said nothing about the factor. Verse 17 makes it clear Abraham's age was also a factor, and not a factor, poetry. The literal reading of the text is pretty clear. Yeah, it is literally synonymous parallelism. And the ages, I feel like saying it's a factor or not is itself kind of begging the question. It's not about factors at play, at least not within that verse. If you want the factors, you go to the context. And the context says Abraham had to wait, let's assume he got married at 20. He had to wait 80 years before his first legitimate child was born. So after that hypothetical 80 years, he was pretty happy, as if a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. Then he gives this argument that says because Abraham sent his additional sons that he had with, what's her name, Katara? I don't think it's Katara. Whatever her name was. Oh, here it is. Oh, I was actually pretty close. Keturah. That because he sent his sons away that were from Keturah, that for some reason that must mean they were older than Isaac. that does not follow. For one thing, just because the inheritance usually goes to the oldest doesn't mean the father can't give his inheritance to whoever he wants. He doesn't have to get rid of the rabble in order to make sure it happens. Next point, Haley says, he points to another video he created to elaborate on the alleged symbolism of the patriarchal ages. Even if he is correct that some of the numbers have symbolic significance, that doesn't preclude them from being literal. Then IP complains more about Haley not watching his other videos. He complains about that a lot. And then he says, my point in that video was that there is no reason the ages are both symbolic and literal. Here's one reason. If they're both possible, that's a reason. But IP has a much bigger mountain to climb if he wants to prove that they are symbolic at all, let alone only symbolic. Case in point, Joseph is a type of Jesus. There are obvious similarities. So in a way, Joseph is symbolic of Jesus. But guess what? Joseph is also literal. So it is easily possible for something to be both literal and symbolic. God actually does that many times, using literal events and giving them symbolic meaning. And the last bit for this section, the last part for this section is that Hades says that he can't even say what many of the particular numbers represent. And IP says, yes, I admit this. That's because a lot of the cultural knowledge of the ancient world is missing. Well, you just shot yourself in the foot there, because if you can't say what the numbers represent, how can you say they represent anything? And going back to my point I made earlier, even if they do represent something, how do you know that representation wasn't taken from the actual ages? For instance, maybe Adam's age represented the first, which would be kind of weird, but whatever. That could easily just them taking the number of his age and assigning meaning to it, not them taking a number that had meaning and assigning it to his age. Here's another to talk about. Okay. However, he once again assumes this was a secret attempt to attack CMI. He says Jones has ignored what we have said about what it means to take Genesis plainly or even literally. I never read it because my video was not directly aiming at CMI. If you recall, this specific verse was directly aiming at YECs like the infamous Kent Hovind, because IP likes to pick on Kent Hovind for some reason, because it's easy. Who openly admitted to claiming he takes all of Genesis 2 literally. I am glad Haley admits metaphors in text. Now perhaps 2 contains more, especially as he quotes. So here's the problem. The reason CMI takes it as if it was a personal attack is because you labeled your video Top 10 Biblical Problems for Young Earth Creationism, not Top 10 Biblical Problems for Kent Hovind. It's pretty ironic that someone who complains a lot about Haley from CMI not checking out his videos, that he did not check the major sources, the major young earth creationists, like the professionals. Instead, he just goes to Kent Hovind. He goes to popularizers. And then he conflates all young earth creationism beliefs into those categories. And of course, misunderstands what plainly and literally means. That still applies. Let's say the same point I just made. Not all young earth creationists assert all the claims I went over in my video. Why Haley insists on claiming that I made the video to attack CMI is beyond me. It shouldn't be beyond you. You made your video attacking all young earth creationism. The way you presented your video gives us all rights to take it personally. If you want to make a video attacking Kent Hovind, then title it as such and make that clear in the premise that you gave at the start of your video. And IP makes this argument that about the dust of the earth, that Adam couldn't literally have been made from the dust of the earth, because Genesis 3:19 says, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." And he thinks that if you take that literally, then you must, if you take that metaphorically, then you must take Genesis 2:7 metaphorically, where he's created from the dust. Problem is that in Genesis 19, it actually says, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Trying to take this metaphorically does not make sense. For you are dust. What would dust be a metaphor for? Insignificant, perhaps, is what you say? Alright, let's replace dust with insignificant. For you are insignificant, and to insignificance you shall return. Why would he return to insignificance if he already is insignificant? That does not make sense. But the plain reading of even just that verse indicates he was created out of dust. So later, complaining about Haley's argument against IP's recap argument, he notes that Genesis 3:20 says Eve is the mother of all living. This cannot be literally true. Eve was not the mother of Adam or the animals. Guess what? She also wasn't the mother of Eve. This is IP purposely assuming that young Earth creationists are hyper-literal. Nobody who would say that Eve is literally the mother of all living would mean she's her own mother, or the mother of Adam, obviously, or animals, obviously. And it is some other arguments about Jabal being the father of those who dwelt in tents and have livestock. That sounds like he invented tents and invented shepherding, or at least the more modern form of shepherding. And his brother was Jabal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. So he invented the lyre and invented the pipe. Guess what? Eve did not invent the living. This argument isn't actually terrible, but when he assumes it cannot literally be true, then he makes it terrible. Point number 3 says, he says that Exodus 20:11 says, all was made in 6 days, so Adam must have been created on day 6. My view is not that Adam are material manufactured from other materials. Grammar, hello? Haley again complaining that he's not watching your videos. Hoo-hoo. Plus, there is no preposition for in Exodus 20:11. Well, let's read that. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now let's read that without the preposition in, and see if that changes anything. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. How does that change anything? And he agrees that the days are literal days. Here's another. He says, Jesus also said that God's expectations for marriage are rooted in the way he created humanity from the beginning of creation. Mark 10:6. Not billions of years later. And IP says this is an example of why he sees cherry picking when something is literal or not. A literal marriage would have been established on day 1. This is IP cherry picking what he wants the definition of literal to mean. If you want to be that hyper literal about it, then marriage wouldn't be established on just day 1. It'd be established on second 1. This is ridiculous. Often by the genius is generally referring to the whole of creation process over the week, which is fine. He says it's fine, but he still felt the need to try and hyper-literalize it, as if he was making a point. But that is not a literal reading. Yes, it is. You are apparently hyper-literal. It's like you don't use the word literally. You use it hyper-literally. The context of Mark 10 implies Jesus is talking about the beginning of the creation of marriage. No, it doesn't. It says, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. There is potential for it to mean the beginning of marriage, but that doesn't really fit that well, and it just makes more sense to be the beginning of the creation. Creation of marriage. speaking of the creation of something doesn't have to mean the creation week of Genesis 1. For example, Revelation 3:14 says Jesus is the beginning of creation of God. It says, for example, Revelation 3:14 says Jesus is the beginning of the creation. He forgot to put the in there, which is important for the grammar. Is the beginning of the creation of God. This is not a reference to Genesis 1. Likewise, in Mark 10, Jesus is talking about the creation of marriage and its beginning. Hold on a second. If that's not a reference to Genesis 1, saying Jesus is the beginning of the creation, what exactly are you saying this means? He doesn't actually mention that. The beginning, comma, or hyphen, comma. Jesus is the beginning, comma, of the creation of God. No, Jesus is the beginning of the creation, comma, of God. That is clearly saying Jesus created everything, and Genesis 1 is the start of creation week. So I don't see how you don't think that's not a reference to Genesis 1 without begging the question. And Mark 10 could easily be talking about the creation, not the creation of marriage. It's possible he could be talking about the creation of marriage, but it's not likely. Next one. Haley then suggests there are theological problems with asserting that Adam is not the first man. He says, if these other people were not sons and daughters of Adam, were they fallen in Adam? And if so, on what basis? Yes, IP says. For the same reason we are saved in Christ. Oh, so they chose to be fallen in Adam. Because guess what? Jesus didn't actually save everybody. He died for everybody, but not everybody is saved. So by that same argument, not everybody before Adam is fallen or was fallen. But the Bible says otherwise. Every man has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We do not have to be biologically descended from Christ. He is our priest, and all who call on his name are grafted into him. So if we call on the name of Adam, we're grafted into him. Because I never called on the name of Adam. Does that mean I'm not fallen? Likewise, Adam was the first priest of creation and represented all of creation before God. He failed, and Jesus, the priest who succeeded for us, all died because Adam failed in the first temple. Where's your basis for this biblically? Where is the punishment for Israel because a priest failed? There might be punishments because a king failed, but there's a clear distinction between king and priest. So there isn't a theological problem here. Yes, there is. You really just made it worse for yourself. Understand priest Adam, you understand Christ. It's our representative. Well, Adam is our representative, but not because we chose him like we choose Christ. He's our representative because he's our ancestor. And then Haley basically makes the same argument I did about the Jeremiah 4 reference. It's logical to interpret the later passage in terms of the earlier passage it quotes, not vice versa, as Jones does. And IP seems to think this is a baseless assertion. That's a logical assertion. Let's say I were to quote The Hobbit for whatever reason. It would be logical to interpret whatever I say in terms of the whatever context I'm in, and by what I'm quoting, possibly within context, depending on the context. But it does not make any sense to interpret The Hobbit by that one time I quoted The Hobbit for whatever reason. That is completely backwards. Do you think the assertion has a base now? IP's next argument is that you cannot have an evening without a sunset. You cannot have a morning without a sunrise. So Genesis implies the sun was already there on day one, except that the Hebrews measure their time in sunrise and sunset, in the morning and the evening. And Genesis wasn't written as it was happening. It was written after the fact. So when Moses is writing, the evening and the morning are the first day. He's just making it clear that this happened in a day, in a 24-hour period. Down here, IP quotes Kings 1:12, for your father, Solomon, made our yoke heavy. And he concludes, Solomon was a harsh and cruel ruler. That is another unwarranted extrapolation. Just because their yoke was heavy doesn't mean Solomon was cruel. Maybe you can say harsh, but you can't assume cruel just from a heavy yoke. And about IP says, my point was using bar doesn't necessarily mean it is about material creation. And given the context Jeremiah 4 adds, which we already disproved, can function fine with a temple inauguration interpretation. But again, remember what the video was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about the plain reading of the text disproving a young earth interpretation. And he admits right here that this argument does not disprove a young earth interpretation. He's only arguing that his interpretation is conceivably possible. That is not a problem for young earth. And that's it for that. Maybe someday in the future I'll do a more detailed rebuttal to his Genesis series. But for now, I've got better things to do.